Buying your first one wheel can be a pretty daunting experience. I bought my first one about 4 or 5 months ago. The amount of research that I did beforehand to try and understand what board was going to be ideal for me and meet my needs was quite restrictive. It took a long time. Since then, I've learned a lot about what makes a one wheel, the different purchasing decisions that you've got. And in this video, we'll go into depth about everything that I've learned. I'll give some advice on what I think you should do if you're looking to buy your first one wheel. A one wheel is a self-balancing skateboard with a single large wheel in the middle. It works a lot like a unicycle, and there are several components that go into making that happen. The first component we'll talk about is the rails. They're generally machined from a single piece of steel, and they have to be incredibly strong to hold your full body weight. Now, the shape of the rails is the main thing that we're concerned about. You can get several types of rails. The stock boards from Future Motion often come with flat rails. The rails that I'm riding are called WTF rails, and they are in more of a W shape. People often say with stock rails that it feels like you're riding on the board, and changing to W rails or lightning rails makes it feel more like you are inside the board. So it just changes the center of gravity and the amount that you feel locked into your board. The next thing to talk about is the footpads. So similarly to the rails, the footpads can have different shapes, which will change the amount that you feel locked in. Now, the primary purpose of the front pads, particularly the front one, is there's a sensor on there, and you can have 3 different types of sensors. You can ride with a dual zone sensor, you can ride with single zone sensor, or you can ride what's known as a posi. The board is propelled by a motor. It's called a hub motor, which means the motor itself sits inside of the hub. Now, the power of the motor defines the maximum speed, the maximum torque that you will have. Bloody hell, that was storms. The motor has a wattage which defines its maximum power output. If you're a heavier rider, generally you will need a more powerful motor. Lighter riders can tend to get away with a less powerful motor. Now, the board is powered by a battery. You will often see denoted as P and S. So for example, I am riding a 15S3P cell. That means I essentially have 15 batteries in series, and when you do that, you combine the voltage. So the number of cells that you have in series defines the maximum voltage of the battery. So when you have cells in parallel, that means that you connect, for example, a 3P pack will have 3 parallel cells. If you have cells in series, the voltage, the power increases. And if you have cells in parallel, then the capacity combines. Now, another thing that you have on the board with the battery is the BMS. The BMS is the battery management system. And what that will do is make sure that all of your cells stay at a healthy capacity. As your cells degrade, as power is pulled from the board, not all of those cells will lose power at the same rate. And what your BMS does is it makes sure that they stay full to the same amount. So you might have, as you're riding, one cell that drops 10% more than other cells. If you then charge that board and then ride again, you'll keep losing 10% each time, and they'll fall quite severely out of scope until one of your cells might fail. So what the BMS does is it makes sure all cells stay at a healthy voltage. And the last component to talk about is the controller. Now, the controller is what tells the motor to move forward, move backward, and keep you balanced on the board. So it uses gyroscopic sensors, and it will calculate what the motor should be doing in order to move you forward and get you riding. Another limiting factor for power of the board are the MOSFETs. They live on the controller, and they are what feed current from the battery to the motor. They will define the maximum power of the board along with the voltage. So you take the voltage and the current, the maximum current, and when you multiply them together, that gives you maximum wattage. Now that we've talked about what makes up a board, it's important to talk a little bit about the UK scene. If you've heard the name Onewheel, that's actually a trademark of a company called Future Motion. And they are the first ones who brought the one-wheeled skateboard to market. They hold a lot of trademarks for the one-wheel, and they enforce them. There's a lot of sentiment within the community that they have stifled innovation. I won't go into that here. But what it does mean in the UK is because they are fairly anti-right to repair, if you have an issue with your board in the UK, they will ask you to pay a few $100s to ship it back to the US. A lot of the UK scene have either moved to buying used Future Motion boards, older boards that are more repairable and that it is easy to find parts for, or they will switch to using VESC, and there's a number of ways you can do that. In terms of purchasing options, if you're wanting to buy new from Future Motion, you can either get boards shipped from the US, or there are stores in the UK, for example, Ride and Glide, I'll link below. Currently, you can buy their small form factor board which is called the Pint. Now, the Pint has a couple of variations. The Pint itself is quite low mileage. The Pint X is a higher mileage variation. And you also have the Pint S, which is a trail-specific version of the board. It comes with a tyre designed for trail riding. Now, a Pint is designed as a commuter board, sort of for students in the US, doing 5-10 miles around campus. So if you're intent on doing any serious riding, any group rides in the UK, Pint's maybe not your best option because your range is going to be severely limited on it. The Pint X and the Pint S are considered pretty good starter boards from Future Motion. They will run you at around £1,600 if you buy them new. The Pint will run you about £1,000 if you buy it new. So they're not cheap to buy new. They do come with warranty, but as I've said, you'll have to ship them back to Future Motion if you do have any issues. Then you have the GT series, the GT and the GTS. The GT is a much more powerful board and definitely one to consider if you're a heavier rider. And then there's the GTS as well, which has much higher voltage and is a much more powerful board for anyone who wants to get into racing and trail riding. Then you have the more recent board from them, which is the XR Classic. Now, the XR Classic is basically a GT in XR clothing. Now, I ride a custom board that is based on the XR form factor. The XR is widely loved by riders, and Future Motion have brought out the XR Classic to try and jump back on some of that nostalgia train for that older board that they discontinued. A GT is going to cost you somewhere around the £2,000 mark. An XR Classic is going to be somewhere around the £2,000 to £2,300, £2,400 mark. And a GTS can cost you anywhere from £3,000 up. If you're buying in the UK, buying a used Future Motion board can be a really good option. You can pick up used Pint boards for as low as £350, £450. Used Pint X for around the £700, £800 mark. Used GTs, I'm not really sure. I've never looked to buy a GT board, so you'll need to do your own research there. But I do believe they hold their price quite well. And then you also have the older XR, which has been discontinued. Now, the XR, in my opinion, is the best way to get into riding one wheel in the UK. The older XR form factor is much more repairable. There are a lot of third-party parts, such as footpads, sensors, rails, you name it, that are designed to fit with the XR form factor. They have proven their reliability for years and years. And since so many people own them, getting spare parts, getting support for repairs is very easy. You do have the option for buying used Pints. You do have the option for buying used GTs. But if you're in the UK, or should I say not in the US, I think a used XR is generally the most cost-effective and safe option. VESC is the Vedder electronic speed controller. It was designed by a guy called Benjamin Vedder, and it is an open source speed controller designed to control the speed of motors. In recent years, the VESC community has started to develop a lot of Onewheel boards because of the restrictions that Future Motion put in place around using their patents. Because Future Motion have a monopoly, their boards haven't necessarily gone through the development that they could have, and the VESC community has picked up a large amount of that development. So if you're looking to buy a VESC board, you have a few good options. Two pre-built boards, the Fungineers X7, the Funwheel X7, and the Floatwheel ADV2, or the Floatwheel series. Both of those boards are excellent first forays into the world of VESC. They come with everything you need to ride out of the gate. The X7 is special because it's fully compatible with the XR form factor. It's generally considered a great option because it means that you will be able to swap parts in and out with any third-party supplier that makes XR compatible parts. The Floatwheel is also considered a great board. It's on its own form factor, so it doesn't have an incredible aftermarket parts library yet, but that is growing over time. Your next option for VESC is what I run, which is a drop-in kit. Basically, a replacement for your existing controller. It has all the stock connectors. You take your board apart, open up your stock controller box and your battery box, you drop in a new BMS, you drop in the new controller, you put it all back together, and you have VESC. Full customizability of all of your riding. You can set up alerts. You can see I've got a headphone in. That headphone is connected to my phone, which is connected to my board, and I'm able to monitor what's called my duty cycle. And if my duty cycle gets too high, the board will send an alert to my ear so that I know I'm pushing the board to its limit. If you're interested in getting into VESC, buying a used Future Motion board and modding it and putting your own drop-in kit in is, in my opinion, the best way to get into VESC. It will run you for a fully custom board like I have around the same price as a pre-built, but you get to make all the decisions around what battery you want, what BMS you want, and you don't need to do a lot of soldering. You just need to be able to open up the controller box, be careful plugging and unplugging some electronics, and it's a really great way to get into baby's first DIY VESC. Another option for VESC is to build your own, do it yourself. There's lots of controller options out there. There's U-Box, there's the 4300 from the Fungineers guys. There's tons of different options. They support loads of different voltages. They support loads of different motors. DIY VESC is going to require a lot of research, a lot of soldering, understanding connectors, looking at wiring diagrams. If you are highly experienced with electronics and tinkering, it can be a good option, but I wouldn't say you should do it for your first foray into Onewheel. Get yourself a Onewheel, make sure you really like it, and then dive down the DIY VESC rabbit hole. Now, in addition to DIY VESC, you also have Pubwheel. This is the open source VESC movement. There's tons of controller boxes, rails options. It's all open source. If you've got a 3D printer, if you've got a CNC, that's a really good option for you. So if you're into DIY, that's sort of DIY plus, and that's a really great option for just building your board the way you specifically want it. Custom batteries, custom controllers, you name it, it's all possible, but it's not a good entry point. There's tons of great resources out there. The Float Life is an aftermarket parts manufacturer. They have all sorts, rails, they do footpads, waterproofing kits, a lot of aftermarket parts, and unfortunately you will have to pay import fees on anything you buy from them because it'll come from the US, but they often run sales. There is Flow State PEV run by Adam, and he often does orders from the Float Life. Flow State's a really great way to avoid some of those import fees because he'll do bulk orders and get a bit of a discount. You also have Craft and Ride, which is another aftermarket parts manufacturer. They are more about aesthetics. They do some custom rail options and stuff like that. They're much more about the aesthetics of your board. Again, coming from the US, so import fees. The stock sensors that come with the Future Motion boards aren't hugely reliable, so there's a really great aftermarket option. There are several available. The one that I use is from Stoked Stock. Their V-Star sensor range, I use their V4, which is absolutely perfect for me, been super reliable, never let me down. You have customwheel.shop, which is an EU store with loads of VESC parts and loads of custom connectors and stuff like that. So if you are thinking about getting into VESC, that's a really great option to jump in with. Go and have a look at their store, see what they've got available. That's more your DIY side. We also have the Facebook group, which is the Onewheel Riders Collective, which is a really active group. Tons of great knowledge in there from riders on the UK scene. If you're thinking about getting into Onewheel, definitely jump in there, say hey. If you have any issues with your board, that's a really great place to jump in and you'll be able to find some support. It's worth mentioning safety gear, so I'm currently wearing a helmet and I'm wearing wrist guards and elbow pads. I don't have any knee pads on because I don't have any good knee pads that fit under these trousers yet, but I'm looking to buy some. If you're doing sort of gentle, chill street riding or main path trail riding like I'm doing today, I'd say that that's all you need. If you're considering doing any heavier trail riding, going out, doing mountain bike trails, that sort of stuff, you need a full face helmet, you need decent gloves, wrist guards, you need full body armor, you need padded shorts. Just protect yourself if you're going out. You can't beat the physics of this board. Sometimes if you overtorque the board, it doesn't have enough power to keep you up, it's gonna nosedive. If you do that at 18, 19, 20 mile an hour on a forest trail, you're getting dumped. Full face helmet, protect your chin, protect your wrists, protect your elbows, protect your shoulders, protect your back. Doesn't matter what you look like, you don't want to come off your board and cause yourself a life-changing injury. It's worth mentioning that if you're looking to find trails to ride in the UK, Onewheels technically live in a grey area, but if you get caught on the road with them, if you get caught in certain public places, certain public parks by police, you're just as likely for them to give you a fine and take the board off you as you are for them to ask you what it is and get really interested and say, oh, that's really cool. They exist in a grey area, so there is no guarantee that if you get stopped by the police, you're going to be all right. So generally, I try and ride on quiet trails. If there's dog walkers, general walkers, bikers, cars, anything, just stop. Let them go first. We do a lot of riding in forest sites, lots of riding on the sorts of bike trail that you can see me on today that's just near my house. Think about where you can ride. Don't be a dick, basically. If you are wanting to find places to ride, I'll link below the Onewheel Trailfinders website, which is run by Ed from the Facebook group. It's a really great place to get started in finding some options for trail riding and just generally seeing what's in your area. So I got into Onewheel about 5 or 6 months ago. I've learned really quickly, and I thought I'd just talk you through my journey of how I got to the board that I've got today and the decisions that I made along the way. So I started out looking for a board. I was considering a Pint X or an XR. I read online that the 4209 hardware revision of the XR is widely considered the best option, really refined from their first versions, but it isn't locked down in the way some of their older versions were. There was also an update a few years ago that introduced something called haptic buzz, which basically makes the board vibrate when you're reaching the limit of it. That firmware update came with a little bit of malicious code, which essentially shut down your ability to read cell voltages, shut down your ability to use custom batteries. So if you're looking for a board, the sweet spot is a 4209 XR 4134 firmware. So you want 4134 firmware, you don't want the later firmware revision. So after a couple of weeks of research, I decided on an XR. I managed to find a 4209 board and I bought it for £750 off someone local. Within a few days of riding it, I hit a puddle. The sensor started ghosting, which basically means that the board doesn't detect when you've got off. It had the stock sensor on it. Rather than keep riding the board, I decided I'm going to buy a new sensor, and I also put new grip tape on. I didn't want to make the mistake of riding through water again without having a waterproof board, so I also bought the Badger kit. I got that from the Floatlife EU. Now, the Badger kit is decent, but you can pretty much do everything it does with just a bit of silicone. If you don't know what to buy, the Badger kit is a really easy option with great instructions, so, you know, use your head. After I badgered the board, I started going out riding with some locals. I met someone locally who had a load of spare parts. He had some Footpads, he had a new sensor, and he had some WTF rails. I got a really great price on them, and I installed them on the board, and the new rails and the new Footpads completely changed the feel of the board, really made me feel locked in, and were much, much better for trail riding. But I was finding that when I was riding up the trails and I was going up a hill, the board was doing a lot of torquing, which is basically the motor was suddenly like zoop, zoop you to try and catch you up. And I was just feeling that lack of power when I was riding on the stock battery pack. So I bought a RBXR battery upgrade, which essentially doubles the battery capacity. And that means you don't have more power per se, but you've got more sustained power because the battery will deplete slower, which means you'll have higher voltages for longer. I wasn't comfortable putting that battery in my stock battery box, so I bought a torque box, which is basically a custom battery enclosure with a lot more space than the stock battery enclosure, which is really suitable for battery upgrades. And finally, I decided to round it all off with an XRV install, which is a drop-in VESC kit, which has given my board VESC capabilities and hugely improved the torque because the MOSFETs on that are much bigger. So for around the cost of £2.5 grand, slightly less than that, I've got a fully custom board. I do have a load of parts that I can sell to recoup some of that money. I'm really happy with the purchasing decisions I've made. But I do think about the fact that if I just bought a pre-built VESC, I'd have had a slightly more powerful board, albeit with lower battery capacity for not much more money. If you are watching this video, that probably means you're looking at buying your first Onewheel. And my advice to you is either buy a pre-built VESC and spend the money and buy a decent board that's super capable. If you're going to ride a lot of trails, buy the X7. If you're going to ride a lot of street, maybe consider the ADV2. Have a look at both the boards that are available from Fungineers and from Floatwheel and make a decision about what suits you best. If you aren't 100% sure you're going to stick with it, buy a used XR. They're incredibly repairable. They're incredibly upgradable. The community support around them is absolutely massive. And the best thing about buying a used board, if you're not sure you're going to stick with it, or you think you might get into it and then want to upgrade, you always have the option of selling it for similar money, if not the same money as you bought it for, and making a different decision. Overall, consider your budget. Consider how much money you're willing to spend. You can always jump into the Facebook group, Onewheel Riders Collective. You can always jump on Reddit. There's tons of forums available where you can go in to chat about Onewheel and get some advice specific to your situation. I spend a lot of time through the spring, summer, autumn, going out the house, taking my kids out on a night. I go foraging, I go hiking, and I lose that in the winter. And buying this board in September, my wife has said, completely took me out of my winter funk. A lot of people I speak to talk about the difference to their mental health from owning one. If it's something you think you might like, consider your budget, consider your purchasing options, and just give it a go.